Coming up on the Get Lean, Eat Clean podcast.
Well, as I educated myself, come to find out, well, all of your hormones are actually regulated while you're asleep. So if you interfere with the cycles of sleep, then you interfere with the production and sensitivity to hormones. And then all these other complaints like sex drive and emotional stability and mood and concentration, go figure, all of that gets repaired, regenerated, restored, and set while you're asleep. So once I learned, how these sleep drugs can interfere with the processes, the normal processes that go into sleep, and we can talk about that to whatever detail you want. But once I learned kind of what's supposed to happen when you sleep, and then how can these drugs interfere with that, well, then it made perfect sense that Ambien was a big contributor to what they were doing.
Hello, and welcome to the Get Lean, Eat Clean podcast. I'm Brian Grin, and I'm here to give you actionable tips to get your body back to what it once was 5, 10, even 15 years ago. Each week, I'll give you an in-depth interview with a health expert from around the world to cut through the fluff and get you long-term sustainable results. This week, I interviewed former Navy SEAL and sleep expert Doc Parsley. We discussed how prioritizing sleep will optimize your hormones, how much the body actually repairs itself during sleep, along with aging in sleep, sleep and its effects on athletic performance, ingredients that might aid your sleep quality, and his 3 tips to optimize your sleep. Well, this one was all, as you can tell, all based around sleep. I really enjoyed my interview with Doc Parsley. I know you will too. Thanks again for listening and enjoy the show. All right. Welcome to the Get Lean, Eat Clean podcast. My name is Brian Grin, and I have Doc Parsley. Well, welcome to the show, Doc.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. And I'm glad to have you on. I was telling you off air that we haven't done a full podcast around sleep. We touch on it as like a huge pillar of health. So I'm excited to have you on and just talk about, your business and sort of what got you into this realm of health. Perhaps before maybe you go into that, I know your background is pretty intricate regarding, Navy SEALs and then med school. So I'd love to just share. I'd love for you to share your story.
Yeah. All right. So I grew up, and kind of small town Texas. Grew up from in a very almost rural, I would say, is on the borderline of rural Texas, and came from a very traditional blue collar family. I'm like 12th generation Texan. And it was just, it was just something always assumed that, if you're able bodied, you go do your military time. And so I just always assumed I would do it. I didn't really have a plan for what it was going to be. But I played a lot of sports. I was a pretty good athlete. I was a terrible student. So after 4 years of high school, I just accumulated enough credits to be a sophomore. Okay. I just dropped out and got a GED. But one of the sports I played, one of the sports I did, I boxed, and my boxing coach was the Marine recruiter for my hometown. And so it was kind of this unspoken idea that I was going to go Marines, probably Marine recon. I wanted to do something challenging. And then, this documentary came out about Navy SEALs. It was called 48 Hours. It was a news documentary show, like 60 Minutes or something. And they covered the first 48 hours of Hell Week. And they kept, emphasizing how this was the toughest training in the military, toughest training in the world, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, well, I want to do the toughest training in the world, So one day when I knew the Marine recruiter wasn't in town, I went down to the recruiting station. I joined the Navy, and I wanted to go through SEAL training. I didn't really know what a SEAL was. I mean, very few people did. So I didn't know 100% what I was going to do, but I figured, something like Rambo. So I honestly, I didn't even know I was going to get paid. I'd been in the military for several months before I realized they were going to pay me to do it. I just thought, they're going to give me clothes and place to sleep and food, and I'm either going to be training or, operating. So,
Yeah.
um,
What year were you in the Navy SEALs? I'm just curious.
So I joined, I joined the Navy in like December of 87. And then I actually left for boot camp in, I want to say like June of 88, or maybe before that. Might've been May.
Okay.
And did my boot camp in Orlando, and then went up to Great Lakes to do gunner's mate, which is called A school, apprenticeship school. Since 90% of people fail SEAL training, they train you to do a job beforehand so that when you fail, you have a place to go. They have a place to send you. You're qualified to do something. So I did that training, and then went through SEAL training. Obviously, made it through. I got stationed in San Diego as a SEAL. Obviously living in San Diego, I ended up meeting a girl out in San Diego, falling in love, getting married, and she was from San Diego. So, when I got out of the SEAL teams, it was really just because I just wanted to do other things. We had the Gulf War while I was in, but that lasted like 6 minutes. So just kind of did a lot of the same redundant training cycles over and over and over again. And, it was a fun job, but it just didn't seem like it was going anywhere other than to just keep doing what I've been doing. It's kind of a young single man's job, and I was becoming neither. So I decided, go out and do something else, and didn't have any aspirations of medical school or anything. I mean, I like I said, I wasn't even a high school graduate. I thought, maybe an athletic trainer, something like that in that world. And so I started working at San Diego Sports Medicine Center I volunteered there to get my hours, and because I was thinking about maybe a physical therapy school. And they hired me on, and I worked there the whole time I was in college. So I worked there for 6 years because I had to go to junior college, obviously, because I couldn't even qualify for college. And I did, 5 years with junior college and UCSD combined. And, along the way, the doctors at San Diego Sports Medicine Center talked me into, throwing my hat in the ring for medical school. Really kind of shamed me into it, because I was like, there's no way I could get into medical school. Like, you guys need to slow down. Like I just barely, I didn't even get through high school. I mean, we're setting the goals a little too lofty here. And this one doctor said to me, he said, well, it isn't a matter of whether or not you could get in. The question is, would you go if you got in? And I said, of course I'd go. And he said, well, then why wouldn't you try? And I was like, all right, well, I mean, you kind of, that's a pretty good point. So, all right, I'll try. And so I got into the military's medical school. I didn't even know they had a medical school until I was applying. And, since I was already married and I already had a kid and I had another kid on the way, it just made sense to go where they would pay me to go to medical school instead of the other way around. And the way the military always works is they'll do, they'll train you to do anything, but you pay it back with time. So it's basically, it's usually the contract's about 2 to 1. So 4 years of medical school, and then you have to be a doctor for them for 8 years. And so I figured I would get back to the SEAL teams, be able to get back to the community that, really shaped me as an adult, but as a human. I mean, it was, very formidable years in my life. And so, I figured I would go back there and do a bunch of sports medicine, which is what I was, is what I was good at. It's what I spent all my time training as. And I was planning to, go back to training and finish a residency in orthopedic surgery. And I got to the SEAL teams, and they just received the funding to build their first sports medicine facility. And so they put me in charge of supervising the build out of that. And then I was, one of the people involved in hiring, all of our healthcare practitioners, which we'd never had before. I mean, people would have, this was 2009, 2010. So people would have assumed probably that SEALs had this big healthcare network around them and that we treated them like professional athletes, but nothing could be further from the truth. We didn't have any kind of treatment for them really whatsoever. They would have to, go
do it on their own
across the bridge into San Diego and like go to the Navy hospital and do everything up there. So, obviously I was a really good fit for that, given what I'd done in college and what my intentions were afterwards. So, I supervised the build out of the clinic and the facility. And then, we hired physical therapists and athletic trainers and PT assistants and nutritionists and strength and conditioning coaches and exercise physiologists and all the stuff. And we built this great center. Then I negotiated with the hospital to have like orthopedics rounds come through there twice a month, and pain clinic come through a couple of times a month, and acupuncture came through, and chiropractic came through. And so we had this healthcare mecca at that point. And then that made me the dumbest guy around, right? Because we hired great help. I mean, we'd hired, Olympic training center practitioners and professional sports team practitioners and Division I colleges. Like we got the best of the best. And when you're the dumbest guy in the military, their solution is, well, you should be in charge then. So they put me in charge of supervising this clinic. And what SEALs are a lot like, their job's athletic, and I wouldn't call them athletes because it's too limited, right? Because they don't, it's not a game, and they don't have quantified rules and regulations, and and they don't have an on season and an off season. Like it's a much tougher job than being an athlete, but their mentality is a lot like an athlete, in that their performance is everything. And the worst thing you can do to them is put them on the bench. And the number one person who can put them on the bench is the healthcare practitioner. So usually when they go see doctors, and other healthcare practitioners, they just lie. They just say, everything's great. I got no problems whatsoever. They don't want to share their problems with you because you might put them on the bench. But because I'd been a SEAL, and I'd been a SEAL recently enough to where there were a lot of SEALs there who I'd been a SEAL with, and I had a good reputation amongst those guys. So they started coming to my office and closing the door and saying, "Hey man, let me tell you what's really going on with me, just between us." And, they would come in and say, my mood's terrible. I'm super moody. I'm all over the place. I snap at my kids. I snap at my colleagues at work. I snap on my wife. I go from elated to feeling like crying, like instantaneously all throughout the day. I don't know what's going on. My memory sucks. My concentration sucks. My motivation sucks. I'm getting fatter. I'm getting weaker. I'm losing muscle. My sex drive's poor. My sexual performance isn't where I want it to be. But I'm doing everything. I'm doing everything you tell me, you guys are telling me to do. I'm working with the nutritionist. I'm working with the strength and conditioning coach. I'm doing the meditation. Like I'm doing all the stuff you guys are telling me to do. And my performance isn't where I want it to be. Now you have to take that with a grain of salt, because these are Navy SEALs. So what they consider fat and what they consider unmotivated and what they consider weak, is it's a lot different than what the average person would consider. But it didn't matter, because what they were concerned about was their performance. And they were relying on me and trusting me to do this, but I was a Western trained MD, right? Like I knew how to recognize and treat disease. They didn't have any diseases. So I didn't really know what the hell to do, right? I'm just like, I don't know, like maybe, we'd all heard about combat fatigue and shell shock and, previous wars, right? So we're going on like 8 or 9 years of combat for these guys. I'm like, well, maybe it's something to do with that. And what could that be? And so I started looking in sort of the alternative integrative functional medicine kind of world, which is more performance oriented, obviously. And what I had going for me was that I was the doctor for the West Coast SEALs, and they, the SEALs had a reputation by that point. They'd been in the media, they'd killed bin Laden, they'd done, whatever. They'd had all these successes, and and traumatic stories like, Red Wings and extortion and all that. So, but because, they had a very public image, I could hear someone's TED talk or, go to a symposium and hear someone lecture or read someone's book. And I could just call them up and say, hey, I'm the doctor for the West Coast SEAL teams. And I'm having these problems and it kind of seems like it's in your wheelhouse. Could I train with you? Could you recommend books with me? Could I do, for me? Could I do, could I consult with you on my difficult cases and all this? And so I got to learn a lot really quickly. Like, my learning curve was insane. And, my original postulate, just because I didn't know, I was just getting these enormous lab panels. I was getting 98 different serum markers on these guys, 17 vials of blood they were giving. And, I was just testing everything because I didn't really know what I was looking for. I just knew that they weren't performing well. And, what came back was a picture that would look like a, 55-year-old man who's 30 pounds overweight, and, metabolic syndrome or like flirting with metabolic syndrome, sort of pre-diabetic, which didn't make sense. It didn't match the guy in front of me who was, 28 to 32 years old, still has six-pack abs, is in, looks to be in great shape. And if you measure their performance against the average population, they would be really high performing. But they weren't performing to where they should be, obviously, which is all that matters, or where they thought they should be. And so what I was getting was this picture of really low anabolic markers. So things like testosterone and growth hormone and DHEA, and those are really low. Now, not clinically low, like like normal testosterone is between 250 and 1100. And these guys would come in at like 283 or 260. But if you know anything about that stratification of 250 to 1100, that includes all males, 18 and older who have their testicles and they're alive. Like that's really the only criteria for being in that normal group. So, what do you make of a 280 testosterone level and a guy like that? It's like, well, it doesn't seem ideal, but you can't treat that because it's within the normal range, right? And you can't treat it anyways because the Navy wouldn't let you do it. Like I couldn't have put the SEALs on testosterone replacement therapy because that would have disqualified them from the job. So, their anabolic markers were low. Their catabolic inflammatory markers were really high. Their insulin sensitivity was marginal or poor. I was originally thinking, well, and I was also looking at micronutrients, right? Vitamins and minerals and things like that. And, they had the typical sort of low magnesium levels, low red blood cell magnesium. They had low vitamin D3 levels. And I was thinking, well, maybe this is like, maybe this is an adrenal thing. They're, going through some sort of adrenal mismatch, fatigue, whatever you want to call that. And so I started treating them for that. I was giving them, Myers cocktails, like IV vitamins and minerals, essentially. I was doing cortisol tapers on them to sort of help their adrenals recover. I was giving them adrenal support. I was giving them, supplements like DHEA, some zinc to block the conversion of testosterone to estrogen. And I was trying to see what I could do that way. And I was having marginal success. Maybe 30% of the people were getting 50% better or something like that. It wasn't great. And after about 100 guys came in my office and told me nearly the identical story, one guy, sometimes you hear something that just sparks, it's just a profound moment. And it was nothing profound said, but it was a profound moment where one of the guys said something to me about taking Ambien. He took Ambien every night. And I remember making a note in the margin going, it seems like a lot of guys have said that. I wonder if that could be playing into this. And so I went back after he left, I went back through my records and looked at all the people who'd been in my office, and every single one of them was taking Ambien. And I said, well, that seems like a hell of a coincidence. Let me see what's going on with that. Well, the problem with pharmaceuticals is that when they apply for FDA approval, the pharmaceutical company itself does the research, right? And so they own the research and they give the FDA what they want to give them, and they don't give them what they don't want to give them. And so it's obviously skewed in their favor. However, once they get dragged into court for possibly knowing about some side effects of a drug that they didn't disclose, which was the case with Ambien, they had been taken into court recently. Then they have to give up all their research. They have to give up all the data. And so it had come out that, once I started digging into it. Now, first of all, I didn't know anything about sleep. I never had a single class in medical school on sleep. Neither had any other doctor at that point. So I knew what Ambien was. I knew its mechanism of action, as they say. But I didn't know enough about sleep to know how this could be impacting what I was seeing in their labs. Well, as I educated myself, come to find out, well, all of your hormones are actually regulated while you're asleep. So if you interfere with the cycles of sleep, then you interfere with the production and sensitivity to hormones. And then all these other complaints like sex drive and emotional stability and mood and concentration, go figure, all of that gets repaired, regenerated, restored, and set while you're asleep. So once I learned, how these sleep drugs can interfere with the normal processes that go into sleep, and we can talk about that to whatever detail you want. But once I learned kind of what's supposed to happen when you sleep, and then how can these drugs interfere with that, well, then it made perfect sense that Ambien was a big contributor to what they were doing, and then to the symptoms they were experiencing. But also, most of them were taking Ambien with alcohol, right? So they're having a couple of beers or a couple of cocktails with their Ambien to make them feel sleepy. And if you know anything about the SEAL mentality, if one's good, then two's better and three's great, right? So they were taking way more than they should, drinking way more than they should. And they would go to bed and they'd wake up around 4 o'clock in the morning and they couldn't go back to sleep. And they'd go to the gym and work out really hard and stay at work all day and not take a nap and think they'll come home and go to sleep tonight and everything will reset. And they've been doing that for a couple of years. It hasn't worked yet. It's probably not going to work. So, so I thought, well, let's get these guys off of Ambien and control their alcohol intake, minimize that. I didn't want to try to get rid of it, because you don't want to sound, too puritanical or whatever about any of this stuff. So, and doing that, I mean, I wasn't naive enough to think that it would explain or correct every symptom, but what I had learned was, once I learned a lot about sleep, was that it could explain every symptom they had, right? It was definitely a contributor to everything. And then I went from, 50% improvement in 30% of the people. I went to, about an 80% improvement in about 80% of the guys, right? So that was a night and day. I had 45-year-old men getting PRs in the gym, personal records on their list, personal records on their runs, whatever sports they were into. They were performing not just better, but better than they'd ever performed in their life. And I was like, wow, that's pretty profound. And honestly, it was still in me. It was still in me that I just wanted to go in there and correct everything. Right. I just wanted to go fix their cortisol levels. I wanted to go fix their insulin sensitivity. I wanted to go fix their hormone levels. But I couldn't do that. That the Navy wouldn't have let me, and it wouldn't have been right for them. In retrospect, knowing what I know now, that would have been the worst solution. At some point in your life, you'll need hormone replacement therapy, but not when you're 30, right? I mean, if you start doing it, once you start doing it, you kind of buy into it for life. These guys were tripling, quadrupling their total testosterone levels, quadrupling their free testosterone levels, improving their insulin sensitivity, 30, 40, 50%. All of their inflammatory and oxidative markers were going down. They felt better. They're performing better. Now the SEALs are mixed with a lot of traumatic brain injuries too, just from the blast force of weapons and hitting their heads in training and whatever. So that was contributing to their dysregulation, which was that other 20% that we weren't getting to. So over time, I figured that out, and we started working more with that. And so now it's, now I still work with a lot of SEALs and hundreds of retired SEALs and other special forces guys. And now it's a more complete thing. Like we're still working with sleep, obviously, but we do a lot with, I do a lot with, the TBIs as well. So when I work with them now, and when I work with private clients, I do sleep, nutrition, exercise, stress mitigation, right? And then we work on anything specific with them. But when I first started this lecture series, again, like I was planning on being an orthopedic surgeon. Like I didn't have any burning desire to be an expert in sleep.
Mm-hmm.
But the SEALs had these pre-deployment and post-deployment symposiums, and we would take the entire SEAL team out to a resort for 3 days before they deployed and bring their families out, and you bring in all these services, and teach them about what they're going to be going through, what their family's going to be going through, what are the resources they have, so on and so forth. And we'd bring in guest lecturers, we'd have like Dave Grossman come in and talk about the psychology of killing. We'd have Rob Wolf come in and talk about nutrition. We'd have Chris Kresser come and talk about nutrition and whatever. We'd have John Wellborn come talk about strength and fitness and whatever. And so these were all the health and wellness influencers in the 2009, 2010 through 12 kind of time frame.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would be one of the lecturers at these symposiums, and I got to know these guys, and they started inviting me on their podcast, invited me to other symposiums. And then I just became this sleep guy. And at that time, I was really the only one talking about sleep. There was Dr. Bruce up in Canada. He's a much more conventional, sort of traditional guy. And then there was me, and that was it. And now, I literally got laughed out of the office of the leadership when I was telling them, hey, the guy's hormones are low because they're not sleeping well and they're not sleeping enough. And they're like, dumbest thing I've ever heard, get out of here, And now that's common knowledge. Now the average person knows that their hormones are regulated while they're sleeping, and their appetite's regulated while they're sleeping. And their concentration and emotional stability the next day hinges on the sleep they got that night and all that. So now it's much more accepted, but it was lunatic fringe stuff when I was talking about it back then.
Yeah. Now it's become a lot more mainstream, we should say.
Yeah.
Talking about sleep, and what are some of the things that you learned, or what can people apply that could help perhaps, just in general, improve sleep and get them not only just, the amount of time that you're spending sleep, but the quality of your sleep as well. Right.
Right.
What are some of the type of things that individuals could do? I mean, obviously, with screens and everything, that's like a big thing. I'm actually wearing some light, blue blocking glasses during the day here right now, but
right.
What's some of this? I love talking about routines and things that people can do to help, solidify a solid sleep, night's sleep.
Yeah. So the most important thing, and this is true, I now, I've had the privilege to work with professional sports teams and international corporations and, C-level executives, big time entrepreneurs, like run the gambit. And what I have found over doing this for over a decade now is that the most important step is convincing yourself how important sleep is.
Mm-hmm.
You're wired to sleep already, right? You were born into a world where, one, you're going to die, and two, it takes about 8 hours to recover from being awake for 16 hours. You don't get to negotiate that, right? But we think we can. We think we can negotiate it. And and like when I did my TED talk, I did this metaphor about your surgeon taking a shot every couple of hours during the day just to kind of, keep his nerves steady, and how we wouldn't accept that. But we've correlated sleep deprivation to intoxication, and hundreds, if not thousands, of published literature will show this. And so not only are you impaired as far as like your cognition, your problem solving ability, your mood, your coordination, all the things you think about when you think about being intoxicated, but the thing that people don't think about the most is what's your self-awareness like when you're intoxicated, right? The biggest problem with being intoxicated is you usually don't think you're intoxicated, or you don't think you're nearly as bad as you are. Mm-hmm. And the same thing is true of sleep deprivation. So if you're using your subjective experience on life to determine whether or not you're sleeping well, that's not going to be very helpful, because you don't have a great subjective experience of sleep. In fact, one of the things that makes my job so hard is if I do my job really well and you sleep really well, if you're my client and I coach you and you start sleeping amazing, all you're going to remember is going to sleep, and then you're going to wake up. So you don't have any experiences. And that's like, oh, perfect. And I say, oh, perfect. That's ideal. You don't know if I did anything or not, right? You don't know if you're better because you don't remember sleeping. But one of the things that happens when we don't get enough sleep is we release a bunch of stress hormones to compensate for our lack of sleep. And those stress hormones make you feel more alert. That's the whole point of releasing them. So the first thing I tell people is convince yourself how important sleep is. And this is easy to do because unlike nutrition and unlike exercise research, if you go on something like PubMed or Google Scholar and you put in, anything about sleep research, is very consistent. It's a young field. Sleep science is about 65, 70 years old. But there's not a lot of conflicting information in there, right? It's not like the vegan carnivore debate and nutrition. There's nothing like that. There's no one out there saying you don't need sleep. Right. And anybody who's telling you don't need 8 hours of sleep is trying to sell you something. I mean, literally, they're probably trying to sell you their products.
And just on that note, like, you hear like 7 to 9 hours. Is that, and depending on like, as you age, do you necessarily need a little bit less sleep than someone obviously that's younger?
No, if anything, you would need more, but people tend to sleep less as they get older. Okay. And there's lots of reasons for that. One of the reasons is we tend to accumulate more stressors in our life as we get older, up until a certain point, right? Kind of when you hit elderly, it kind of starts going the other way. But we have a lot more stressors, but we also, by and large, as a society, tend to get in worse physical condition. And we drink more alcohol and take more medications and things like that. And one of the big things that interferes with sleep is just simply discomfort. So if you're metabolically sort of unstable and you have a lot of aches and pains because you don't exercise that regularly and you're not in that good of shape and your circulation's not all that good, you're going to have a harder time sleeping. That's just all there is to it. And when we're young, we have more sleep pressure. We have more sleep drive, building up adenosine. So the breakdown of ATP, adenosine triphosphate, you break it down to ADP and then AMP and then just A, which is adenosine. Adenosine causes the sleep pressure. Well, the sleep pressure, if driven by adenosine, is then dictated by how much adenosine you're producing. The more lean mass you have, the more adenosine you produce. And as we get older, especially when we don't exercise, we lose muscle and we lose lean tissue and we lose the ability to produce adenosine. So there's that in there. There's some calcification of the pineal gland that secretes melatonin. So you could have a slight decrease in melatonin production. But by and large, so think of it like this. I told you it takes about 8 hours to recover from 16 hours of sleep. And this has been validated in a lot of different ways. One of the ways we've done it is something called the bunker trials, where we just put people in a cold, dark room with nothing but a bed and a toilet for 14 hours a day. And then we let them out for 10 hours a day and put them back in for 14 hours a day. And this is way before cell phones or anything like that. So there's nothing for them to do in this room. And the room's dark, so they can't even read or anything. And what we found is that when you first put people in the room, the average person would sleep for about 12 and a half hours. And then over the course of about 3 months, well, anywhere from 6 weeks to 3 months, it would take people to get down to where they slept about 8 hours a day, which meant that they were laying awake for 6 hours a day in a bed in a cold, dark room. So most people can't do that. If you can't lay awake in a cold, dark room, lay in a bed,
what was the purpose
without
of
falling asleep?
What was the purpose of this?
Well, it was twofold. So one, it was to figure out how much sleep people need,
Okay.
how long it takes to pay back sleep debt,
Right,
as they call it. But the other thing it was doing was to give a baseline for performance. So once you do that, once somebody slept consistently for 8 hours a night with the opportunity to sleep a lot more, but they still just slept 18 or 8 hours.
got it.
We call that their baseline. And then you can test them on anything. You can teach them anything then that following morning. And you can say, well, that's your baseline ability, right? That's sort of the genetic you. Now we take away a couple of hours of sleep and test you. Like, have you sleep? We short sleep you 6 hours. Have you come in the next morning and tested whatever skill we're testing on or performance thing we're testing on, and you'll do worse. And initially you'll know you did worse. And when they ask you, how do you think you did? You say, I did worse. I was tired. And then day 2, maybe day 3, maybe, but by day 4, every single person will say, I feel like I've completely adapted to this 6-hour thing. And I think I did as well as I've ever done. And you can show them, nope, your performance is still getting worse. Every day you've gotten worse. And they'll argue with you because their subjective experiences that they felt great. But anyway, so that was one way we've done it. And another thing we've done is there's still almost 100,000 hunter-gatherers around the planet who have never experienced electricity at all. And they still live in huts and shelters they make themselves, and they hunt and gather, and that's all they do. So they live like our ancestors. And when we studied them, and we put actigraphy on them, and they'll lay down about 2 or 3 hours after the sun goes down, and they'll fall asleep, and they'll wake up around the time the sun comes up, and that averages out to about 7.5 to 8 hours a night. So we know this is the ideal. It's the way we're designed to be. So if you have people sleeping 8 hours a night, then we know you're basically doing recovery to the way you were designed. So going back to my sort of metaphors, the reason I'm going to sleep 8 hours tonight is because I've depleted a bunch of resources today, and I've damaged myself to some extent today. Obviously, when I work out, like if I lift weights to get stronger, I don't get stronger while I'm lifting weights, right? I get weaker while I'm lifting weights because I'm damaging the tissue. Once that tissue regenerates, which happens while I'm asleep, once that repairs, it will repair in a way to be able to lift more weight. It'll repair to be able to contract harder. It'll be thicker. It'll have more little actin heads, and it'll be able to do more work. And if I'm doing endurance activity, the cellular organelles will change. So I'll have more mitochondria. I'll be able to do, more outphos and all that stuff. So, my brain and my body are going to use today as a template to repair and restore. So it's going to replenish, right? I'm going to repair from today, and I'm going to prepare for tomorrow. So if you think about it logically, if I could repair 100% and I could prepare 100%, when I wake up tomorrow, I wouldn't be any worse off, right? By definition, I've repaired 100%. So I'm exactly the same tomorrow morning as I was this morning. Mm-hmm. Well, that means I didn't age. And if I could do that every night, I would never age. And if I never aged, I would never have the risk factors that are associated with age, which is basically fewer resources. And I'm not as resilient. I can't repair from injuries, and I can't fight off infections and parasites and things like that as well, because really what being elderly means is that you have fewer resources. You have less muscle mass. You have fewer anabolic hormones and fewer anabolic processes going on. You have a weakened immune system. you don't store energy as well. You don't have as good of circulation. You don't have as much oxygen flowing to your tissues. And all of those things make you more fragile. And the more fragile you become, the more likely you are to die from any cause. So if I could sleep 8 hours and recover 100%, I would just go on forever that way, but I can't. Mm-hmm. Right? When I'm younger, I do. Like when you're a little kid, you're actually getting better, right? You sleep more than 8 hours, but you sleep for 12 hours and the kids wake up the next day smarter and stronger and taller and faster, right?
Right.
And then at some age, somewhere around 25 to 35, we sort of plateau and it's a net zero. And then after that, we start repairing maybe 99.97% every night. And we're losing a little bit and we're getting older. So if you think about it, that means if I choose, and by the way, humans are the only mammal on this planet that chooses to sleep deprive itself. Okay. The only time any other animal will sleep deprive itself is when it's starving, right? It's under famine. So it needs to be able to wake up earlier, to travel further, to forage more, to find food. Or if it's being stalked and preyed upon, right? So if it's in a dangerous environment, it'll only sleep as much as it needs to be. There's good reason to suspect that we're the same way, right? I mean, this is a 100,000-year-old body at minimum. So we evolved in a very similar fashion. So there's good reason to suspect that our brain is perceiving us as possibly under famine or possibly being stalked,
right?
If we're choosing to sleep deprive ourselves. And our physiology and our behaviors the next day support that. Because when you're sleep deprived, when you're a little sleep deprived, you make worse food choices. You make the food choices of somebody who's starving. And one of the things that you want to do when you're in famine, which all animals do, is you want to kind of shut down the prefrontal cortex and you want to take more risk-taking behavior. You want to be able to try novel food. This is what happens when you start putting houses in the middle of an area where the natural habitats of animals, and they'll stay away from houses and people's trash cans and stuff until they start starving. And then they're going to go take that risk. So that risk-taking behavior is the same in humans. When you're sleep deprived, you take more risk. You say more dumb things. You're more willing to do sort of irrational things. And your appetite regulation is that of something starving or being preyed upon. But anyways, I digress. So if the point of me sleeping 8 hours tonight is to repair the best I can to try to not age, if I choose to sleep 6 hours, I'm choosing to age 25% faster. Okay. There's no way around that. You can't sleep faster. You can't say, well, I'm going to increase the quality and just get all the sleep I need in 6 hours. It doesn't work that way. Ideal quality still requires about 8 hours of sleep. And if you don't have ideal quality and you're sleeping 6 hours, maybe that's more like 5 hours or 4 hours. So maybe you're aging 50% faster. So back to your original question, those are the type of things that I tell people to focus on. Like, go to Google Scholar, go to PubMed, put in sleep and whatever you care about. Like sleep, I don't care what it is, sleep and business, sleep and problem solving, sleep and parenting, sleep and mood, sleep and communication, sleep and sleep and strength, sleep and whatever. And read until you're scared, right? And once you've convinced yourself, then you don't need that much coaching, right? You don't need that much information.
I was just going to say, what about alcohol's effect on sleep? Because I just think a lot of times people probably use alcohol. They think that'll help them sleep, but does it hurt the quality of that sleep?
It does. So when when we track people's sleep, so the first thing that's important to realize is that, one of the questions I get all the time is, what happens when we sleep? And my retort is, what happens when we're awake, right? A million things happen when you're asleep. A million things happen when you're awake.
Right.
All right. We basically have two flavors of sleep. It's a little more complex than this, but I'll, in a simple way of explaining it, we have deep sleep and we have REM sleep.
Right.
So deep sleep is what we call slow wave sleep. So when we do a sleep study on somebody and we're measuring we're measuring their brain waves in a mass sort of way. So yeah, a good metaphor I've heard is like if you lower down a microphone into a sports stadium, you could hear people doing the wave, right? If they're doing that, and that would be like slow wave sleep.
Right.
Or if everybody's just chattering individually, that's more like REM sleep, or maybe more like being awake. So you have REM sleep, which is primarily working on your brain. It's primarily working on your learning. So everything that you learn today, you're going to rehearse tonight. Every conversation you have today, you're going to rehearse tonight. Everything you've thought about today, whether it's related to those other two things or not, you're going to think about again tonight. And the things that you learn will be taken from your short-term or working memory to your long-term memory. And then the more important that information is, and the more things in your brain that you could connect to that, you form these really durable pathways. And the more durable the pathway, you can think of it the difference between like a little varmint trail going from here across the street to like a super highway. That would be the really durable pathway. And that allows you to access this information from multiple different angles and think about it in novel ways other than the way you've learned it. And now you really know that information and you can work with it. Also, if you say, like, if you have a fight with your spouse over something trivial, like dirty dishes in the sink, well, any emotion around that conversation logically should be gone as soon as that conversation's over, because that's just not a big deal, right? But if you don't sleep well, you actually emotionally categorize that argument while you're sleeping. So if you don't sleep well and you misfile that or don't file that, then the next time that comes up, that can cause a lot bigger emotional response than is warranted. And so you want to make sure that you're getting enough REM sleep to stabilize your mood and emotion, your cognitive processes. It's replenishing also the nutrients in your brain. You have storage, sort of, so to speak, in there. It's getting rid of waste products in your brain. So you allowing your brain to work in its ideal fashion. And like I said, it's regulating your appetite as well. During the deep sleep, the slow wave sleep, that's the wave inside the stadium, right? That's the most anabolic time in your life. So most people have heard of fight or flight. Fight or flight is the maximum amount of stress hormones, right? And we'll just say cortisol to make it easy. So maximum cortisol. And I mean, really the maximum, the best your body can do to secrete cortisol right now, as much as it can possibly produce, that's fight or flight. The exact opposite of fight or flight is deep sleep, right? You're sort of superhuman when you're in fight or flight. If you've ever been in fight or flight, like, you get in a fist fight, or you get assaulted, you almost get in a car crash, or you get in a car crash, or somebody shoots at you, or like whatever, some kind of really big threat. You're superhuman, right? You can see better, smell better, taste better. Like your reflexes are faster. You have more endurance, more strength. Your cardiopulmonary system's ramped up. But it's catabolic. You're using 100% of your resources to fuel your body to get out of that situation. So if you lived in fight or flight, you'd probably die in about 2 days. The exact opposite of that fight or flight when you're superhuman is deep sleep. And deep sleep, if fight or flight is maximally catabolic, deep sleep is maximally anabolic. Anabolic, we're taking small, simple things and building big, complex things. So if I eat a steak, I break it down into amino acids. Those amino acids go through my bloodstream, and my body can use those amino acids to do lots of things. One of the things it can do is, say, like, build a muscle. So I turn that amino acids into protein structures that then build my muscles up. And now that I've done an anabolic action. Actually, when I'm in fight or flight and I'm releasing all these catabolic hormones, one of the things that happens, and definitely happens when you're in famine, starvation, is my cells will need amino acids. If I'm not eating amino acids, if I don't have the opportunity to eat steak, well, then my body's going to use my muscle as a source of amino acids, and it's going to break down my muscle and release amino acids for the other cells to use. So that would be an example of catabolic behavior. So anabolic behavior is when you're getting stronger, right? You're repairing your damaged tissues, like I was saying, from exercise, or if you have a strained ligament or tendon, right? You've injured yourself a little bit. You've been cut. You have a little bruise, whatever, like you've damaged yourself a little. You have a viral infection, a bacterial infection, a parasitic infection. Any of that stuff is anabolic to, it requires anabolic activity to repair that. And so all of your anabolic hormones are being regulated during deep sleep. So about 90 to 95% of all the anabolic hormones you produce, you're going to produce in about the first 4 hours of sleep and every day. So if you're shorting yourself that deep sleep quality, whether it's quality or quantity, you're shorting your anabolic activity. And if I don't repair anabolically, well, then I'm essentially catabolic, right? Because being alive is catabolic. I'm more catabolic than anabolic right now because I'm awake. I'm not eating. I'm using energy, right?
Right. So like working out, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Working out is catabolic, right? You're breaking things down, and then going to sleep is anabolic. It's when you're building it back up.
Right.
What about disruptions of sleep? Like, this is a common complaint. Like they get to sleep and then they have to go to the bathroom, right. 2 times, 3 times during. Can you regain that sleep some way? Or, how is that process?
No. So like I said, the first half of the night is primarily deep sleep. And then the second half of your sleep through the morning hours, those are primarily REM sleep. And you're doing the different things like I'm talking about, like I talked about earlier, right? So if I wake up during deep sleep, I interrupt my anabolic behavior. And now I have to go back to sleep and get back into it. Now, if I'm only awake a couple of minutes and I go right back into deep sleep, if I have to get up and go to the bathroom, big deal, right? Same thing in the morning. If I wake up at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, I'm probably in REM sleep. I'm interrupting my REM sleep. So if it's strictly episodic like that, I would say even if you had to get up and go to the bathroom 4 times, if you're going right back to sleep, probably not a big deal. What's a bigger problem, and people oftentimes don't even recognize this, they just know that they don't feel great when they wake up. A lot of the people will complain. They'll say, I feel worse when I wake up than when I went to bed. Like I don't want to go to sleep because I'm going to be more tired when I get up in the morning than I am right now. I'd prefer to just stay up. And that obviously can only work for so long. But what happens more often is people just have really poor quality of sleep. So take something like, just do something simple. Like you don't have a really comfortable bed, right? And whether it's too hard or too soft, ends up kind of the same thing. You become uncomfortable, and that triggers your body and your brain to wake up and move to a more comfortable position. Well, if I'm in REM sleep, I'm completely paralyzed. If I'm in deep sleep, I'm almost paralyzed, right? So I have to wake up and come out of that in order to roll over and move. Now, I might not remember that. I might not have no conscious awareness of that whatsoever. But if I do that 50 times an hour, I do that all night, I'm going to wake up tired the next day. And so if you have a really hard bed, if your mattress is too hard, it can compress your blood vessels, right? And if you compress the capillaries in your skin, you decrease or stop the circulation, you can start building up an inflammatory response, and your body will want to move because it's uncomfortable. When we're asleep, our eyes are still working, our nose are still working, our ears are still working. We can still feel things. We just aren't paying attention to it. But enough of it can make us pay attention to it, right? As evidenced by you can flip on a light and wake somebody up, or make a loud noise and wake somebody up. Everything's still working. So when I'm laying in bed, when I go to sleep, I'm not consciously processing how comfortable my bed is. But if my bed's too hot, or I'm compressing my blood circulation too much to where I have to move, or if my bed's too soft, it sinks down and it compresses my joint in a weird angle, and that causes some pain. Now I have to move over. The mattress is too hot, I have to move around and find a cool spot, whatever it is. If you do that all throughout the night, you're going to be exhausted. You're going to wake up the next day again, feeling like you wish you wouldn't have gone to sleep.
Is,
But if you're getting good quality sleep and you have to get up, let the dogs out once, get up, go to the bathroom a couple of times, not a big deal.
okay.
It'd be ideal not to do that. But, when I work with my clients, I always say, there's ideal and then there's reality.
Right.
And we do what we can to mitigate, we do what we can to supplement and, mitigate in between ideal and reality.
Is there I wrote this down. I wanted to ask you, is there a best sleeping position that you recommend?
Yeah. It's called the semi-prone, where it's essentially your chest is flat on the
bed.
Flat on the bed, as though you were laying on your stomach, but your hips are almost on your side to where your legs are like out a little bit.
I think I might do that.
That creates the least amount of tension on the low back, which is the most commonly sort of compressed joint, and it distributes your weight the most evenly.
And then what about putting something in between your knees so that you're sort of aligned?
If you lay completely on your side, then your knees will bend forward and that'll rotate your low back a little bit. And you can compress on that. I mean, if you do yoga every day or something, that probably doesn't matter. But if you're, an average man, you weigh a couple of 100 pounds and, you don't do yoga every day, then that's probably going to compress your spine. It's hard to keep something between your legs because that's like, that's something that kind of requires some awareness. So I would recommend trying to do the semi-prone thing.
Okay. Gosh, I feel like if it's an hour's past, I feel like we can do another hour. Maybe we'll do a part 2. On sleep. I think I would like that. Because I wanted to get into, I know that you have, you have a product line, a sleep remedy product line. And, with melatonin, tryptophan, maybe tell us a little bit about your formulation and how it can be beneficial.
Yeah. So my formulation, I didn't develop that as a product to sell. I developed that when I was working with the SEALs because I wanted to get them off of Ambien, and I couldn't they were taking Ambien because they couldn't sleep, obviously. So I had to give them something else.
Right.
And I was telling them to quit drinking alcohol. So what was I going to give them? And so that was just through my own research and then working with the SEALs. And we just came up with a concoction of everything that made sense to put in there. So things that I could measure that I knew were low, like things like vitamin D3 and magnesium, obvious, those things are in there. A very light dusting of melatonin. You don't want to take over the brain's job of producing melatonin, but you can give enough to sort of initiate the cascade. So most people who've heard of the tryptophan coma, the Thanksgiving Day nap on the couch, right?
Right.
It's not that turkey has more tryptophan than any other meat. It's just nobody tends to eat 2 pounds of steak, but you probably eat 2 pounds of turkey. And then, we're throwing in some carbohydrate crashes and stuff in there too. But so the production of melatonin is tryptophan becomes 5-hydroxytryptophan with the help of magnesium and vitamin D3. 5-hydroxytryptophan becomes serotonin. Serotonin becomes melatonin. Melatonin, as most people know, is the initiation, sort of the starter pistol of the sleep cascades that make you feel sleepy a few hours later. So that's what my product is. Tryptophan, 5-hydroxytryptophan, magnesium, vitamin D3, light dosing of melatonin. And then one of the big chemical changes in your brain is the production of this neuropeptide called GABA, gamma aminobutyric acid. And that makes it, like I was saying earlier, all of your senses still work. You're just not paying attention to your environment as much. So we're doing what's called lowering the resting potential of the brain. And that's what GABA does, is it makes it harder for those neurons to fire. So you aren't paying attention to your environment as much. So the product is the production pathway of melatonin, a little bit of melatonin and GABA. And then recently I added some phosphatidylserine in there to decrease cortisol, because high cortisol levels interfere with your ability to sleep well and get quality sleep. So there's nothing magic in there. There's nothing in there that makes you go to sleep. All it does is it sets your brain up with everything that it needs and kind of initiates the cascade to help you initiate what you need to go to sleep and to make sure you have all the resources to go to sleep. So you could take it right now and it's not going to make you sleepy because you're not in that environment,
state, right? So it's sort of just it's obviously all natural. So a sense that it's just sort of helping you. It's like
it's truly supplemental. I mean,
right.
it's the actual definition of supplement. Like we're just supplementing your natural storage to make sure everything's in there. Anything you don't need is going to be in your urine. It's going to be in your bladder or your colon within like 3 or 4 hours. So there's nothing in there that makes you fall asleep. There's no trick in there. Like all the pharmaceuticals, there's a trick. Like Ambien is a trick. It acts like GABA, but 1,000 times more powerful than GABA.
Right.
But that has some consequences, right?
Drowsiness, knocks you out, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you have it in a tea or in a pill form, is that right?
Yeah. So I prefer the tea partially because it kind of creates a bedtime ritual. And that's a big part of getting good sleep is to have some sort of, ritual that you're doing to get ready for bed. Just like when you get a little kid ready for bed, we need to get ready for bed as adults as well. Right. And the liquid absorbs faster. Obviously, you're not having to dissolve capsules. But people who don't want to take the drink or don't like the taste of the drink, they have prostate issues. They don't, it makes them go to the bathroom too much if they drink it. So they'll do capsules.
Okay. Yeah. I'm looking at it right now. That's great. Well, this was good. This went by fast, and perhaps we'll do a part 2 and just keep going because I have a lot more questions for you regarding sleep.
Yeah, I'd be more than happy.
Yeah, that would be great.
I'd be more than happy to do another one.
Okay. Yeah, let's do that. I guess on that note, what my last question that I have for you is this is a question I ask a lot of guests is, we talk about how you can get your body back to what it once was when you were 20 and 30. What would you give someone maybe to get their sleep back to what it once was when they were in their 20s and they could, potentially maybe even sleep in sometimes and get good quality sleep? So what type of tips would you give that individual to get their sleeping patterns back to what they once were?
Yeah. So again, the most important step is convincing yourself of how important it is.
Right.
Once you get there, like you're already wired to sleep, it's pretty easy to get sleep. But if you look at, sleep hygiene and all these sleep programs, sleep ritualization, all this stuff that people talk about, there's 3 things. If you think about your ancestors, just think about 1,000 years ago, how did people go to sleep? Well, the sun went down, so the blue light left their eyes. That initiated melatonin, that initiated a bunch of cascades. Their GABA increased, their brain started slowing down. We're a very visual animal. It was dark. We couldn't see at night. We didn't have flashlights. We didn't have electricity. So there wasn't much to see. There wasn't much to interact with. Mm-hmm. And because the sun went down and we didn't have HVAC, we got colder. So those are really the 3 cues for being ready for sleep. So 1, you need to block the blue light in your eyes a couple of hours before bed. There's a million ways to do that. Next, though, you need to decrease your interaction with your environment. So it's not enough to wear blue blocking glasses and sit down at your computer and work till 9:59 and get in bed at 10 o'clock. You're not going to go to sleep quickly. So you need a protracted period where you're slowing down and you're not paying attention to your environment very much. And if you're watching television, you watch something dumb and trite. You don't watch the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. You don't watch something that's super emotionally stimulating to you. And then you have to decrease your body temperature. And you can do that with showers and baths and air conditioner in your house. But really, now the other part is that, exercise, nutrition, and stress mitigation, all of that matters in your ability to go to sleep. Right. So you have to do the other stuff right in your day as well, to help you go to sleep. But if you take it seriously and give yourself, at least an hour, I'm not saying you have to turn off all the lights and start meditating and all that in an hour, but you need to start thinking about going to sleep and decreasing your attention span and all that. So on my website, one of the things I have is I have a PDF on like how to get stress out of your life when you're sleeping, how to deal with everybody has stressors and how to deal with that so that it doesn't interfere with sleep. It would take me an hour to explain that, but it's just kind of a ritualization. It's just like some ways to think about things and some things to write down and
quantify. The sleep journal. Yeah, I'm a big fan of journals. Yeah. I came out with the intermittent fasting journal, so I love journals and writing things down and keeping track. And one other thing I was just going to say is going to bed around the same time. I find that for me is very helpful. Is that something that you
I mean, we're never going to get back to using the sun as our exclusive cue,
right?
But the closer you can be to going to sleep 2 to 3 hours after the sun goes down and waking up around sunup, I mean, that's the way you evolved. That's the ideal performance out of this machine that you inhabit. So, I recognize people work night shifts and have, again, there's ideal and there's reality, and we can talk about how to compensate in between those two. But, the ideal would be, go to sleep 2 to 3 hours after the sun goes down and wake up around sunup every day.
Okay.
That's the way you evolved.
Well, Doc, this was good. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And, like I said, I think we got a lot more questions lined up, so maybe we'll do a part 2 add on to it, because there's a lot we can go into. So I appreciate you coming on, though.
Yeah, man, my pleasure. Look forward to the next one.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks for listening to the Get Lean, Eat Clean podcast. I understand there are millions of other podcasts out there, and you've chosen to listen to mine, and I appreciate that. Check out the show notes at briangrin.com for everything that was mentioned in this episode. Feel free to subscribe to the podcast and share it with a friend or family member that's looking to get their body back to what it once was. Thanks again, and have a great day.